As we continue to read the book of Genesis, we are going to continue to see how God is revealing his one story of restoration, how he's going to restore all of the nations of the world back to himself. And so the one story of God that we have been following is how God is bringing about a human descendant of Adam and Eve. And so far in the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, we have traced that from Adam and Eve through their son Seth, all the way to Noah, and now all the way to Abraham. And as we read the rest of the book of Genesis, we are going to see how God has been preserving the family line of Abraham and how he is going to bring about a descendant through Abraham, through his son Isaac, through his son Jacob, and through his son Judah. And that is eventually going to lead us to Jesus. So the rest of the book of Genesis is going to focus on how God is bringing about that human descendant through the family line of Abraham. And remember in chapter 10 and 11 of the book of Genesis, the story of the Tower of Babel, where in Babylon, all of the people, they wanted to receive the glory for themselves as this place between heaven and earth. And so because of that, God, he scatters them across the world. He confuses their language. It is against the backdrop of that place, Babylon, that God is going to call Abraham out of. And so God is going to call Abraham out of that land to go to a new land, to go live a new type of life that God is going to reveal to him. And so Abraham is presented as a new Adam. And God is going to establish his covenant with Abraham and his family. And it's going to be this picture of how God wants to relate to his creation. That he doesn't want to just be distant from it, but that he is going to enter into a personal, intimate, covenantal relationship with Abraham and his family. And this is going to be the pattern for how God is going to relate to his chosen people the rest of the Old Testament. And when God calls Abraham, he tells him that through Abraham, he is going to bless all of the nations of the earth. And so although God is going to choose Abraham to be the main primary focus of his blessing, the blessing is still for the whole world. That God's one story of restoration is ultimately for the whole world, but it is going to be Abraham and his family that is going to take center stage in the rest of the book of Genesis. And so as we read the stories of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob, and Joseph and Judah, we want to pay attention to how God is preserving the family line, how God is going to work miracles to ensure that the descendant of Adam and Eve that's going to restore the earth is going to come. And what God has done for Abraham and his family, he is going to continue to do throughout the life of the Israelites and even in the lives of believers today. And so we can trust that God, he is faithful. And the story of Abraham, it gives us a picture of that. So when God calls Abraham to be in this covenantal relationship with him, he desires that Abraham would walk faithfully with him. And that's the picture we're going to see of Abraham as we read the stories of his life. He is going to be a man of faith who is going to walk with God, who is going to know what God desires of him, and he's going to obey God's commands. And throughout all of the stories of Abraham, it is clear that Abraham has faith. But at the same time, his faith is limited. And so through the trials and the tests of life, through the different stories we read about, Abraham's faith is going to be challenged. Because faith in God doesn't just happen overnight. It's a lifelong journey with God, learning to trust and obey him. So as we read the stories of Abraham, we're going to see how his faith in God is going to grow, how he's going to learn to trust God completely, and how his faith is going to impact those around him. And we're going to see that God is going to bless Abraham and his family, and that those who are with Abraham will experience God's blessing. But those who separate themselves from Abraham, they're going to experience difficulty in life. So it is in these stories that we see that God is always the source of life and blessing. That as he brings about his descendant that's going to restore the earth, that only his plan, only his will is going to be accomplished. That God is sovereign over all things. And so the stories of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob and Joseph and Judah, they are all going to highlight the same things. That whenever humans try to achieve God's life and blessing apart from God's will, it's going to fail. Over and over again in these stories, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, they all are going to try to bring about God's plan themselves. But every time, their plans are going to fail. They are going to try to ensure their safety, to ensure that they have a descendant that can carry on their family line. They're gonna pick and choose who they favor, but all along, God has been working. And it is going to be clear as you read these stories that God is going to be the one, the only one that can make the family line of Abraham continue according to God's plan. But these stories are also going to highlight how faithful God is. That even though Abraham is going to fail, even though he's going to try to do things his own way and achieve God's blessing on his own, God is still entering into this relationship with him. He is still maintaining and sustaining the life that is going to be carried on through Abraham and his family. That God, he is going to remain faithful because of who he is. And in the life of Abraham, we are going to see how God is going to become the only source of hope and blessing for Abraham. That he is going to completely trust and obey him. But that also Abraham has this responsibility to teach the next generation what it means to follow God, to walk in the ways of God. And so as we move into the story of his son Isaac, we see that Isaac is going to have the same struggles that Abraham had. That a lot of the stories are going to be very similar because Isaac also has to learn what it means to walk faithfully with God, to be in this covenantal relationship with God, and to see how God is going to bring about his descendant to continue God's plan of restoration. And so the life of Isaac, although it's pretty short in the book of Genesis, once again, it's the same thing as in the life of Abraham. We are going to see how Isaac is going to either trust God or put God's plan in jeopardy. And so as you read the stories of Isaac, once again, pay attention to how God's plan of restoration is put in jeopardy. But also pay attention to how God is going to be faithful to his promise to bless Isaac and his family.